The gravel crunched under the tires of Mark's SUV as they pulled up to the cabin. Towering trees surrounded them, their skeletal branches reaching up to the gray sky. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and something else, something Mark couldn't quite place. He shivered involuntarily as he stepped out of the car. "Well, this is cozy," David said, slamming the door shut and surveying their temporary home. The cabin looked old but sturdy, its wooden walls weathered by years of facing the elements. A faint mist clung to the ground, swirling around their feet, as if alive. "Perfect place for a horror movie," Tom joked, nudging Mark with his elbow. "Right, Mark?" "Yeah," Mark replied, forcing a smile. "Let's hope we don't end up starring in one." They unloaded their bags and headed inside. The cabin's interior was rustic, with a large stone fireplace dominating the living room. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight that filtered through the grimy windows, and the air was stale, carrying a scent of damp wood and age. "Definitely needs some airing out," Emma said, her voice echoing slightly in the hollow space. Sarah wandered over to a large, worn-out armchair by the fireplace. "I think it's charming," she said, dropping her bag beside the chair. "Has character." Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He chalked it up to the unfamiliar surroundings and tried to focus on enjoying the weekend. This was supposed to be a fun getaway, a chance to reconnect with friends and escape the monotony of daily life. As they explored the cabin, they found an assortment of antique trinkets scattered around, an old phonograph, a dusty stack of books with leather-bound covers, and a faded painting of the forest outside. It was as if the place had been frozen in time, untouched by the modern world. "Guys, check this out," David called from the corner of the room. He was kneeling on the floor, prying up a loose floorboard. Underneath, hidden in the dark recess, was an ornate box, its surface carved with strange symbols. "Whoa," Tom said, leaning in for a closer look. "Looks like some kind of old treasure chest." Emma and Sarah joined them, curiosity piqued. Mark hung back, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He watched as David pulled the box out and set it on the floor. It was heavy, the wood darkened with age, and a large brass latch held it shut. "Should we open it?" David asked, a mischievous grin on his face. "I don't know," Emma replied, biting her lip. "What if it's like cursed or something?" "Oh, come on," Tom laughed. "It's probably just full of old junk. But let's find out." David hesitated for a moment before flicking open the latch. The box creaked as it opened, revealing a set of cards and a small, tattered booklet nestled inside. The cards were intricately decorated, each one depicting an eerie, almost grotesque figure. The booklet's cover was embossed with the title "The Ritualistic Game." Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the contents. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners deepening. He exchanged a glance with Emma, who was frowning, her eyes fixed on the box. "Looks like we found our entertainment for the night," David said, picking up the booklet. "How to play the ritualistic game." "Are you serious?" Mark asked, his voice tense. "This thing looks like it belongs in a horror museum. Maybe we should just put it back." "Relax," Tom said, grabbing one of the cards and examining it. "It's just a game. Probably some old party trick from the 60s or something." Mark wanted to argue, to insist they leave the box alone, but he didn't want to be the killjoy, not on the first day. He took a deep breath and forced himself to laugh. "Yeah, you're probably right," he said, though every instinct screamed at him to get rid of the box. "Let's at least read the rules," Sarah suggested, taking the booklet from David. "Might be fun." Mark watched as she flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing as she read. He couldn't help but notice how engrossed she became, her eyes widening slightly as she scanned the text. "Well," Emma asked, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. "What does it say?" Sarah looked up, her face pale. it says. We have to follow the rituals exactly. Or else. Or else what? Tom asked, smirking. Or else we suffer the consequences, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. A heavy silence settled over the group. Mark's mind raced, the uneasy feeling growing stronger with every passing second. This was supposed to be a harmless retreat, a break from reality. But now, with the box open and the game revealed, it felt like they had crossed an invisible line. Well, I'm not planning to suffer any consequences, David said, breaking the silence with a chuckle. Let's play this stupid game and get it over with. The others laughed nervously, but Mark remained silent, his eyes fixed on the box. As the shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward them, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just set something terrible in motion. Something that wouldn't be easily stopped. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows as if something wanted to get in. The group sat in a circle on the worn-out rug, the ornate box open in the center, like some ancient, forbidden relic. Mark's unease had only grown since they found the game, but his objections had been drowned out by his friend's curiosity and bravado. All right, so how do we play this thing? Tom asked, rubbing his hands together in mock excitement. Sarah flipped through the booklet again, her expression grim. It says each player draws a card and performs the ritual task described on it. We have to follow the instructions exactly, or, she trailed off, glancing nervously at Mark. Or we suffer the consequences, Mark finished, his voice laced with skepticism. He didn't believe in curses or ancient rituals, but the whole setup was unsettling. Something about this place, about this game, felt wrong on a primal level. Yeah, we get it, David said, rolling his eyes. But come on, it's probably just a bunch of silly dares. I bet this was some kind of party game for hippies back in the day. Right, Emma added, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. Let's just play a round and then we can move on to something else. Mark sighed, feeling a weight settle in his chest. He didn't want to play, but refusing would only make things worse. He decided to go along with it for now, hoping that it would turn out to be nothing more than an odd diversion. Fine, he muttered. Let's get this over with. David reached into the box and drew the first card. He flipped it over, revealing an image of a man with hollow eyes, surrounded by crows. Beneath the illustration was a line of text in an archaic script. Read it out loud, Tom urged, leaning forward. David squinted at the card. It says, "The watcher light a candle at the stroke of midnight and place it by the window. Speak the words, show me what is hidden, reveal what lies within." Emma shivered. Creepy. David shrugged. Simple enough. I'll do it later. Who's next? Sarah hesitated before drawing a card. It depicted a figure with a deer skull for a head, holding a branch covered in thorns. The words below read the hollow. Draw a circle of salt around your bed before you sleep tonight. Whisper into the circle, protect me from the shadows. Keep the hollow at bay. Wow, Tom said, a grin spreading across his face. They're really going all out with this stuff. Mark watched as Emma drew her card next. The image was of a woman with dark eyes, surrounded by lilies. The text read, "The mourner. Write the name of a lost one on a slip of paper and burn it in the fire. Speak their name 3 times and listen for their voice." Emma's face paled slightly as she read her task, but she nodded and set the card down. "I can do that," she said quietly. Mark's turn came, and he felt a strange resistance as he reached into the box, like an unseen force was pushing back against his hand. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a card. The figure on it was shrouded in mist, indistinct and shadowy. The text read, "The Wanderer. At dusk, walk to the edge of the forest and leave a token of yourself. Say the words, 'I offer this freely,' to mark the path." "Token of myself," Mark muttered. "What does that even mean?" Sarah glanced at the booklet. It says here it can be anything personal, something that represents you. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't like this one bit. It was vague, unsettling. Right, sure. Tom took the last card. It showed a figure with a face covered in black fabric, a key hanging from its neck. The keeper. Stand before the mirror at midnight and hold a key in your hand. Say, I seek the keeper of secrets. Open the door to knowledge. These are some weird dares, Tom said with a laugh. But whatever, I'm game. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the tasks hanging in the air. Mark noticed that the shadows around them seemed darker now, more pronounced, as if the room itself was reacting to the game. Okay, Sarah said finally. Let's do this. The booklet says the game needs to be completed before dawn. Great, Mark muttered. A race against the clock. Just what we needed. They dispersed to prepare for their tasks, an uneasy quiet settling over the cabin. Mark wandered into the small bedroom he shared with Emma. He rummaged through his bag, searching for something he could use as his token. He pulled out a keychain his grandfather had given him, a small compass encased in brass. It had been with him on countless adventures, a symbol of his love for exploration. He stared at it, a knot forming in his stomach. It felt wrong to offer it to, whatever this game was. But he had to do it, to finish this twisted ritual and put an end to the creeping dread that was closing in around them. As dusk approached, the cabin grew colder. The wind outside intensified, howling through the trees like a mournful cry. Mark stepped outside, the compass clutched in his hand. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of darkness against the fading light. He walked to the edge of the woods, each step feeling heavier than the last. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He crouched down, placing the compass on the ground. I offer this freely, he whispered, his breath misting in the cold air. To mark the path. He stood up quickly, his heart pounding. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if something was watching him from the shadows. He hurried back to the cabin, unable to shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake. Inside, the others were waiting. David had lit a candle and placed it by the window. Tom was holding a small key, glancing at his reflection in the mirror. Sarah was pouring a circle of salt around her bed, her lips moving in silent incantation. Let's get this done, Mark said, his voice low and strained. They went through the motions, each performing their task with a mix of nervous laughter and grim determination. The air grew thick with tension, every creak of the cabin settling sounding like a footstep behind them. Mark stood by the window, watching as the last light of day faded, the forest outside swallowed by the night. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had awakened something that now watched them, waiting for its moment to strike. As the clock struck midnight, the candle flame flickered, casting a fleeting shadow on the walls that seemed to move on its own. Mark's breath hitched in his throat as he glanced at the others, their faces pale and tense. The game had begun, and there was no turning back. The clock struck midnight, its chimes reverberating through the cabin like the tolling of a distant bell. The air was heavy with anticipation, the atmosphere in the room thickening with each passing second. Mark watched as David approached the window, the flickering candle in his hand casting a wavering glow on his face. David's task seemed simple enough: light a candle, speak a few words. Yet, as he knelt by the window and placed the candle on the sill, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing a threshold into something far darker than they had anticipated. All right, here goes nothing, David muttered. He cleared his throat, then read from the card. Show me what is hidden. Reveal what lies within. The flame wavered, shrinking as if a breath had been blown across it, though there was no wind in the room. For a moment, nothing happened. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, half convinced that this was all just an elaborate prank left behind by some previous occupants. But then the temperature dropped. The candle's flame turned a sickly blue, casting an unnatural glow across David's face. His eyes widened and he stumbled back from the window, knocking into the coffee table behind him. "Did you see that?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Mark moved closer, peering out the window. The forest beyond was cloaked in darkness, but just for an instant, he thought he saw movement, something shifting among the trees. A figure, perhaps. Or just a trick of the light. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. David forced a laugh, though it came out shaky. "Okay, that was weird. But nothing happened, right? No big deal." "Not yet," Sarah said quietly, staring at the candle. "But I don't think we're supposed to see anything right away. It's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Tom asked, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Sarah shrugged, her eyes never leaving the candle's eerie blue flame. "I don't know. But I don't think we're done yet." Mark turned away from the window, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the game pressing down on them, an invisible force that seemed to coil around the room, watching and waiting. He wanted to stop, to take the cards and throw them into the fire, but he knew it was too late. They had started something, and now they had to see it through. His own task loomed in his mind, the words on the card echoing in his thoughts. The Wanderer. At dusk, walk to the edge of the forest and leave a token of yourself. The compass was still out there, a small beacon in the dark woods, marking a path he wasn't sure he wanted to follow. "I'm going to bed," Emma said abruptly, breaking the silence. "I need to lie down." Mark glanced at her, seeing the fear etched in her face. "Yeah, me too." The others murmured their agreement, and they dispersed to their rooms, the unspoken tension hanging in the air like a shroud. Mark lay beside Emma, staring up at the ceiling as the shadows played across it. Sleep was impossible. His mind was too full of questions, of a creeping dread that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. He couldn't tell. The cabin was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive, pressing in on all sides. He listened to Emma's breathing, slow and steady beside him, a small comfort in the dark. A sound broke the silence, soft, barely a whisper. Mark stiffened, his heart racing. It came again, like the rustling of leaves, but it was coming from inside the cabin. He sat up, straining to hear. It was coming from the living room. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Emma, and crept toward the door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the candle that still burned in the living room window. As he approached, the sound grew louder, a soft scraping, like nails against wood. Mark paused at the doorway, peering into the room. The candle's blue flame flickered, casting an unnatural light over the furniture. At first he saw nothing. The room was empty, still, but then he noticed the shadows on the wall. They weren't right. They were moving. He blinked, his breath catching in his throat. The shadows stretched and twisted, elongating into shapes that didn't match the objects that cast them. They writhed across the walls, black tendrils that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Mark's pulse quickened. He wanted to back away, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The shadows gathered in the corner of the room, swirling together into a single, dark mass. For a moment, they formed a shape, a figure with hollow eyes and outstretched hands. "The Watcher," he whispered, the name from David's card slipping out before he could stop it. As if in response, the figure seemed to turn toward him, though it had no face to show. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something. Anything, but he stood frozen, staring into the empty void where the figure's eyes should be. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the shape dissolved. The shadows retreated, slithering back into the corners and leaving the room in darkness. The candle's flame returned to its normal yellow, flickering softly as if nothing had happened. Mark stumbled back, his breath ragged. He turned and fled down the hallway, back to the bedroom where Emma lay. He shut the door behind him and leaned against it, his heart racing. This was no game. Whatever they had summoned, it was real, and it was watching them. He crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. He needed to tell the others, to make them understand that they had to stop this. But how could he explain what he'd seen? How could he make them believe that the shadows themselves had come to life? Beside him, Emma stirred in her sleep, mumbling something incoherent. Mark lay awake, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. He knew now that they weren't alone in this cabin. Something else was here with them. Something ancient and malevolent. And it was just getting started. The morning light did little to chase away the darkness that lingered in the cabin. Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly into his mug of coffee. His mind replayed the events of the previous night over and over, each time trying to convince himself that it had been a dream. But the shadows, the figure, he couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real. Emma sat across from him, her eyes dark with worry. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shook his head, glancing toward the hallway. The others were still in their rooms, probably trying to sleep off the fear from their own tasks. "Not really. You." Barely, she shivered, wrapping her hands around her mug. "I kept hearing noises, like scratching at the window." Mark's stomach tightened. "I heard something too, in the living room." Emma glanced at him, her eyes wide. "What did you hear?" He hesitated, the memory of the shifting shadows and the figure's hollow gaze flashing through his mind. "Just noises. It's probably nothing." Before they could say more, the others joined them, their faces pale and drawn. David looked particularly unnerved, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with a frown. "Morning," Tom muttered, his voice thick with sleep. "Anyone else have a weird night?" "Define weird," Sarah replied, rubbing her arms as if trying to ward off a chill. "I felt like someone was watching me all night." "Same," Emma whispered, casting a nervous glance at the window. "I kept hearing things, like whispers." David cleared his throat, looking down at the table. "Yeah, well, I saw something." Mark tensed. "What did you see?" David hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the tabletop. "I woke up in the middle of the night and looked out the window. I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, just staring at the cabin. I thought I was imagining it, but when I blinked, they were gone." A heavy silence settled over the group. Mark felt the weight of their collective fear pressing down on him. This wasn't just some game gone wrong. They had invited something into their lives, something that was now watching and waiting. "We need to stop this," Mark said finally, his voice firm. "Whatever this game is, it's not just a game. We need to end it." "And how do we do that?" Tom asked, his bravado slipping. The booklet didn't exactly come with a set of rules for quitting. Sarah pulled out the booklet, flipping through its pages with shaking hands. "It doesn't say anything about stopping once you've started. It just talks about completing the rituals and paying the price if you fail." "Well, that's reassuring," David muttered. "So we're just supposed to keep going and hope we don't screw up." Mark felt a surge of anger and frustration. "This is insane. We should just burn the cards, destroy the box." "No," Sarah cut him off, her voice sharp. She glanced around, her eyes wild. "Don't you get it? If we break the rules, it could make things worse. We have to follow through, or we risk I don't know what." Mark opened his mouth to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. She was genuinely terrified, and for the first time he realized that they all were. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "But we need to be careful. No more taking this lightly." The group nodded in agreement, though the tension between them was palpable. Mark stood up, needing to clear his head. "I'm going to take a walk. I need some fresh air." "Be careful," Emma said, her voice tight with worry. Mark nodded, giving her a small, reassuring smile before heading out the door. The forest loomed before him, dark and silent, the trees standing like sentinels guarding a forbidden secret. He walked to the edge of the woods, stopping at the spot where he had left the compass the night before. It was gone. He crouched down, sifting through the leaves and dirt where he had placed it, but there was no sign of it. His heart pounded in his chest. Had someone taken it, or had it simply disappeared? A branch snapped nearby, and Mark jumped to his feet, spinning around. His eyes scanned the treeline, searching for the source of the sound, but he saw nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He took a step back, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He was about to turn and head back to the cabin when he heard it. Soft, almost inaudible at first, a whisper.
"Mark?"
His blood ran cold. It was coming from the forest, a voice he didn't recognize, but it was saying his name. He stared into the darkness between the trees, his heart thudding in his ears. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. Just the whispering, growing louder, closer. It sounded like multiple voices now, overlapping and merging into a cacophony of murmurs. Mark stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned and ran toward the cabin, not stopping until he was inside with the door firmly shut behind him. He leaned against it, trying to catch his breath, his mind reeling. "Mark, what happened?" Emma rushed to his side, her eyes wide with fear. "It's gone," he managed to say between breaths. "The compass. It's gone. And I heard something." The others gathered around, their faces pale and drawn. "What did you hear?" Tom asked. "Whispers," Mark said, his voice shaking. "In the forest. They were saying my name." A heavy silence followed his words. David exchanged a glance with Tom, his face grim. "Okay, this is officially not funny anymore." "Was it ever?" Sarah shot back, her voice rising in panic. "We need to figure out what's going on, and we need to do it fast. We're in over our heads." Mark nodded, trying to steady his nerves. "We need to finish this game. And we need to do it right." "Finish it," Emma echoed, her voice hollow. "But what happens when we do? What then?" Mark didn't have an answer. None of them did. All they knew was that they had started something they couldn't stop, and now they were trapped in a game with rules they didn't understand. He glanced toward the window, half expecting to see the figure David had mentioned lurking at the edge of the woods. But there was nothing there. Just the trees and the darkness, waiting. Watching. The cabin's dim lighting did little to dispel the shadows that seemed to grow with each passing hour. They had gathered in the living room, the fire burning low in the hearth, as if afraid to cast its warmth too far. The games box sat ominously on the coffee table, its presence a constant reminder of the dark path they had chosen. Sarah was poring over the booklet again, her face pale and strained. "There's got to be something in here," she muttered, flipping through the brittle pages with frantic energy. "Some way to end this." Mark watched her, his own fear reflected in the faces of his friends. They all sat in a tense circle, the weight of their situation pressing down on them like an invisible hand. Each of them had a story to tell from the previous night, each tale darker than the last. "Are you sure this thing is even real?" David asked, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. He was nervously tapping his foot against the floor, his eyes darting toward the window every few seconds. "I mean, how do we know this isn't just some elaborate prank? Or that we're all just imagining things?" Mark shook his head. "You saw the figure at the edge of the woods. I heard whispers. And the shadows." His voice trailed off, the memory of the writhing darkness still fresh in his mind. "It's real," Sarah said firmly, her eyes never leaving the booklet. "This isn't just some game. It's a ritual, a way to summon something. And we started it." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Summon what, exactly?" Sarah glanced up, her face drawn and pale. "I don't know. The booklet doesn't say exactly what it is, just that it's ancient, something that watches and waits." "Great," Emma muttered, rubbing her arms as if to ward off a chill. "So we're being hunted by some kind of forest spirit." "Or worse," Mark said quietly, his gaze fixed on the booklet. "Something that's been waiting for a long time. Something that needs us to finish what we started." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. The rituals we performed, they're part of a larger ceremony. A way to open a door between our world and whatever's out there." David scoffed, though his eyes betrayed his fear. "So what? We're just supposed to keep playing until we, what, invited in for tea?" "No," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "We need to complete the rituals to close the door, not open it. If we don't finish, we risk leaving it open, and who knows what else could come through." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "So this whole game, it's a test." Sarah nodded slowly. "A test of whether we're strong enough to face what we've unleashed. And if we fail, we die," Emma finished, her voice trembling. "Or worse." A heavy silence settled over them, the reality of their situation sinking in. They were playing a game with rules they didn't understand, against an opponent they couldn't see. And the stakes were higher than any of them had imagined. "We need to finish this," Mark said finally, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "We have to complete the rituals and end this." "But how?" Tom asked, his eyes wide with panic. "We don't even know what the next steps are." Sarah flipped through the booklet, her eyes scanning the pages. There are more tasks, more cards to draw. We have to go through all of them, one by one. Mark felt his mouth go dry. What happens if we can't? Sarah looked up at him, her expression grim. Then it's over. And we pay the price. They sat in silence, the gravity of their decision weighing on them. Mark glanced at each of them, seeing his own fear reflected back in their eyes. They had no choice. They had to see this through to the end. "Let's do it," he said, reaching for the box. "Let's draw the next cards." One by one, they reached into the box, drawing their fates from the ancient deck. Mark's hand trembled as he pulled his card, the edges rough and worn against his skin. He turned it over, his heart skipping a beat as he read the words. The Seeker. Venture into the woods at the darkest hour. Carry no light, speak no words. Listen to the whispers of the forest and follow where they lead. A cold dread settled over him. He would have to go into the woods, alone, in the dark, with no light to guide him, only the whispers that had haunted him since last night. Emma drew her card next. The image was of a twisted tree, its roots tangled around a broken mirror. The words read the reflection. At dawn, gaze into a still pool of water. Speak your deepest fear and let the water claim it. Tom drew his card, his hands shaking. He showed a hand reaching out from a dark abyss. The task was simple but terrifying the embrace. Stand in the darkness with your eyes closed. Wait until you feel the touch. David's card was last, depicting a figure cloaked in shadows, its eyes glowing like embers. His task was the most cryptic of all the Watcher. Remain awake through the night, watching over the others. Do not sleep, do not blink, until the first light of dawn. The room was silent, the air thick with tension, as they absorbed the meaning of their tasks. They were being pushed to their limits, tested in ways they couldn't have imagined. Each ritual was designed to break them down, to test their courage and their resolve. "We have to do this," Mark said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "We don't have a choice." Emma nodded, though her eyes were filled with tears. "I know, but I'm scared." "So am I," Mark admitted, his voice rough. "But we have to be strong. For each other." They all nodded, though the fear was palpable in the room. They had no idea what they were up against, only that it was watching them, waiting for them to fail. Mark stood, his heart pounding in his chest. "We start tonight. We do this together, and we finish it." They nodded again, though no one spoke. There was nothing left to say. They were on a path they couldn't turn back from, a game that wouldn't end until it was finished. And somewhere, out in the darkness of the woods, something watched and waited, its eyes glowing with a hunger that could never be sated. The game was far from over. Night fell quickly, swallowing the cabin in an oppressive darkness. The air was thick and still, as if the forest around them was holding its breath. Mark stood by the window, staring out into the void. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches barely moving in the windless night. He had never felt so isolated, so vulnerable. They had decided to go through with the rituals one by one, following the order in which they drew their cards. Mark's task would be first. He had to venture into the woods, alone, without a light. The thought of it made his skin crawl, but he knew they had no choice. This was the only way to end the nightmare they had stumbled into. Emma approached him, her face pale and tense. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should." "I don't know. Just leave. Get in the car and go." Mark shook his head, though the idea of fleeing was tempting. "You heard what Sarah said. We can't just leave. The game won't let us. We have to finish it." "Promise me you'll be careful," Emma whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I promise," Mark said, though the words felt hollow. How could he promise anything when he didn't even know what they were dealing with? He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The others gathered around, their faces grim and pale in the dim light of the cabin. Tom handed him a flashlight, but Mark shook his head. "I can't take it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No light, no words." That's what it said. Tom nodded, though he looked uneasy. "Just be careful, man." Mark nodded, unable to find the right words to say. He turned toward the door, feeling every eye on him as he reached for the handle. The wood was cold beneath his fingers, almost as if it were resisting him. He pulled it open, and the chill night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. He stepped outside, the darkness closing in around him like a shroud. The door creaked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the silence. He stood on the porch for a moment, staring into the inky blackness of the forest. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how very alone he was. Taking a deep breath, he descended the steps and made his way toward the tree line. The forest seemed to welcome him, its shadows stretching out like skeletal fingers to embrace him. He moved slowly, his feet crunching on the dry leaves and twigs that littered the ground. The further he went, the more the darkness thickened, pressing in on him from all sides. He reached the edge of the woods and hesitated. The instructions had been clear: walk into the woods at the darkest hour, carry no light, speak no words. Listen to the whispers of the forest and follow where they lead. Mark took a step forward, crossing the boundary between the cabin's small clearing and the forest's depths. The temperature dropped instantly, a biting cold that cut through his clothes and settled into his bones. He paused, straining his ears, listening for any sound. At first, there was nothing but the rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. But then, as if carried on the wind, he heard it, the whispering. Soft, insistent, like 100 voices murmuring just out of reach. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, beckoning, urging him deeper. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run to the safety of the cabin. But he forced himself to move forward, his steps slow and deliberate. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around him like a shroud. He moved through the trees, the forest closing in around him. The darkness was suffocating, pressing down on him until he felt like he was being swallowed whole. The whispers guided him, leading him deeper and deeper into the woods, until he lost all sense of direction. He was completely and utterly lost. Then, without warning, the whispers stopped. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The air around him felt charged, electric, with a presence that was both unseen and all-encompassing. He wasn't alone. He turned slowly, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness. At first he saw nothing, just shadows and the vague outlines of trees. But then he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the faint light filtering through the canopy. It was tall and thin, its shape indistinct, as if it were made of the shadows themselves. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run, to scream, but he was paralyzed, his feet rooted to the ground. The figure moved closer, its form shifting and twisting as if it were made of smoke. It stopped a few feet away from him, and he felt a wave of cold wash over him. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The entity tilted its head, as if studying him. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed toward the ground. Mark followed its gesture, his eyes landing on the spot where he had placed the compass the previous night. It was there, gleaming faintly in the darkness. But it had changed. It was covered in a thin layer of frost, its brass surface marred with strange, intricate symbols that hadn't been there before. Mark felt a surge of fear and confusion. What did this mean? What was he supposed to do? He looked back at the figure, but it was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. He bent down, reaching for the compass, but his hand stopped just short of touching it. The symbol seemed to writhe on its surface, twisting and shifting into shapes he couldn't comprehend. He pulled his hand back, a wave of nausea washing over him. The whispers returned, louder this time, almost frantic. They swirled around him, a cacophony of voices that made his head spin. He stumbled back, his vision blurring as the forest seemed to close in on him. He turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers followed him, growing louder with each step, urging him to stop, to listen. But he didn't dare look back. He ran through the darkness, the trees blurring past him, until he saw the faint glow of the cabin's windows up ahead. He burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him. The others jumped to their feet, their faces pale with fear. "Mark, what happened?" Emma rushed to him, her eyes wide and panicked. "I.e.," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "I saw it. The entity. It was waiting for me." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. "What did it do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Mark shook his head, his mind reeling. "It didn't do anything. It just watched. And the compass. It's changed. There are symbols on it now." David paled, his eyes darting toward the window. "What does that mean?" "It means it's not done with us," Mark said, his voice hollow. "It's testing us, watching to see if we'll make it through." The group exchanged fearful glances, the reality of their situation sinking in even deeper. They were being hunted, tested by a force they couldn't understand. Mark glanced at the box on the coffee table, the next cards waiting to be drawn. They were in too deep now. The only way out was to finish what they had started. Whatever the cost. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in as the hours ticked by. No one spoke of what Mark had encountered in the woods, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. Whatever had manifested itself to Mark was no mere hallucination. It was a living, breathing darkness that now stalked them, testing their resolve. Mark sat with Emma, holding her hand tightly as they waited for the next ritual to begin. The air was thick with tension, each of them lost in their thoughts, bracing themselves for what was to come. The fire had died down to embers, casting weak shadows across the floor. Tom was next. His task had been simple yet terrifying: stand in the darkness with his eyes closed and wait for the touch. He stood now in the center of the room, looking more uncertain than Mark had ever seen him. "I can't believe I'm doing this," Tom muttered, trying to inject some humor into his voice, but it fell flat. "Just stay calm," Mark advised, though his voice was tight with fear. "Whatever happens, just keep your eyes closed." Tom nodded, taking a deep breath. He glanced at the others, his eyes lingering on each of them for a moment longer than necessary. Then, with visible effort, he closed his eyes. Silence settled over the room, so thick that Mark could hear the pounding of his own heart. He watched Tom, his friend's face strained with the effort of keeping his composure. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to spring at the slightest provocation. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The room was so quiet that Mark could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He found himself holding his breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then it did. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the air grew dense, as if it were being sucked out of the room. Mark felt a cold wave wash over him, making his skin prickle with fear. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, but the shadows seemed to dance just out of reach. Tom stood there, his eyes squeezed shut, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. His breathing became shallow, rapid, as if he were struggling against an invisible force. Suddenly, Tom gasped, his body jerking as if he'd been struck. His eyes flew open, wide with terror. But he didn't look at them. His gaze was fixed on something just behind him, something only he could see. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, don't touch me." Mark's blood ran cold. He wanted to move, to grab Tom and pull him away from whatever horror he was facing, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He could only watch as Tom stood there, trembling, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond words. "Tom, what is it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling, but Tom didn't respond. His breathing grew more ragged, his chest heaving with each breath, and then, slowly, he raised his hand, as if compelled by an unseen force. He extended it into the air, his fingers splaying out as if reaching for something or someone. The air around them crackled with energy, a low hum that made Mark's skin crawl. He knew something was in the room with them, something that had reached out to Tom and was now holding him in its grasp. Tom's hand dropped suddenly, and he stumbled back, his eyes wide and glassy. He looked at them, but it was as if he were looking through them, his mind lost in some dark place. "It touched me," he whispered, his voice hollow. "I felt it, cold and hungry." Mark shuddered. "What did you see?" Tom shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "I can't. I don't want to say." He collapsed into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. The room was silent, the air heavy with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Mark felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. Whatever they were facing was more powerful than anything they could have imagined. It was toying with them, pushing them to the brink of madness. "We need to keep going," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at Mark, her eyes hollow and haunted. "We have to finish this." Mark nodded, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop, to run and never look back. But there was no running from this. They had started something that had to be finished. Emma was next. She had to face her own reflection, to speak her deepest fear, and let the water claim it. They found a small, still pool in the clearing outside the cabin, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on its surface. She knelt by the water, trembling as she looked down at her reflection. Mark stood behind her, his heart aching at the sight of her fear. He wanted to protect her, to take her place, but he knew this was something she had to do alone. "Whenever you're ready," he whispered, his voice cracking. Emma took a shaky breath, staring into the water. "I'm ready." She leaned closer, her face inches from the water's surface. "I'm afraid," she began, her voice quivering. "I'm afraid of losing myself, of becoming something I don't recognize, something dark." Her voice broke, and tears rolled down her cheeks, falling into the water and rippling the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the ripples stilled, and the water went black. Mark gasped, stepping back as the darkness spread, consuming Emma's reflection until it was nothing but a void. The air grew colder, and he felt a presence beside him, a whisper in his ear that made his blood turn to ice. "She's mine," it hissed, the voice cold and malevolent. "No," Mark shouted, reaching for Emma, but it was too late. The darkness surged upward, enveloping her in a swirling vortex of shadows. Emma screamed, her eyes wide with terror as she was pulled into the void. "Emma!" Mark lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling with all his strength. The shadows writhed around them, pulling her back, but he held on, his heart pounding with desperation. "Let her go," he shouted, his voice breaking. The entity's grip loosened for just a moment, and he yanked her free, pulling her into his arms as the shadows dissipated, sinking back into the pool. They collapsed onto the ground, Emma sobbing into his chest, her body shaking with fear. "It's okay," he whispered, holding her close. "It's okay. I've got you." But it wasn't okay. Nothing was okay. They had glimpsed the true face of the darkness that hunted them, and it had almost claimed Emma. They were playing with forces beyond their understanding, forces that would not be satisfied until they had taken everything. Mark held Emma, his mind racing. The end was near, but he had no idea what it would bring. He only knew that they had to survive the final ritual, that they had to see this through to the bitter end. And whatever happened, they would face it together. The night seemed endless, stretching on with a suffocating darkness that pressed against the windows of the cabin. They had returned inside after Emma's ordeal, shaken to their core. Mark sat with her by the fire, holding her close, his eyes never leaving the door. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move on their own, growing and receding like a living entity. Sarah stood by the table, staring at the remaining cards with a look of dread. They were down to the final task, the one that would decide their fate. David's turn. He had to watch over them through the night, a sentinel against whatever lurked in the darkness. David's face was pale, his eyes hollow as he glanced at Mark. "Do you think it will end after this?" he asked, his voice strained. Mark wished he could offer some comfort, but he couldn't lie. "I don't know, but we have to try." David nodded, swallowing hard. He took his place by the window, sitting in the armchair with the card clutched tightly in his hand. "I'll keep watch," he said, though there was little confidence in his voice. The minutes dragged on, every creak of the cabin sounding like a footstep in the silence. Mark's eyes grew heavy, his body exhausted from the constant tension. Emma's breathing was slow and even beside him, but he could tell she was still awake, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and Mark's head snapped up. He glanced at David, who was staring out into the night, his face pale and drawn. "Do you see anything?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David shook his head, but his eyes were wide with fear. "No, but I feel it. It's out there, watching us." A chill ran down Mark's spine. He wanted to believe that they were almost through this, that the nightmare was nearly over, but every instinct told him otherwise. The entity wasn't done with them yet. The hours crept by, the tension in the room growing with each passing minute. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. Mark tried to stay awake, but his eyelids grew heavy, the exhaustion of the past few days pulling him into a restless sleep. He wasn't sure how long he had been asleep when he was jolted awake by a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like nails against glass. He sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered beside him, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, his eyes darting to the window. David was still sitting in the armchair, but his head was slumped forward, his eyes closed. He had fallen asleep. "David," Mark hissed, his voice urgent. "Wake up." David didn't move. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Mark's eyes locked onto the window, and his blood ran cold. A figure stood just outside, its face pressed against the glass. Hollow eyes stared back at him, glowing faintly in the darkness. The figure's hand, long and twisted, tapped against the window in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was the entity. The thing they had summoned with their foolish game. It had come for them. "David," Mark shouted, leaping to his feet. He grabbed his friend by the shoulders, shaking him awake. "Wake up! It's here!" David's eyes flew open, and he gasped, looking around in confusion. The tapping stopped. The figure was gone, vanished into the night, as if it had never been there. "What? What happened?" David stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "You fell asleep," Mark said, his voice tight with anger and fear. "You were supposed to keep watch." David's face crumpled in shame. "I'm sorry. I was so tired." "It doesn't matter," Sarah said, her voice tense. "We have to end this now. We have to finish the game." Mark nodded, his mind racing. The entity was playing with them, toying with their minds. But if they could complete the final ritual, maybe, just maybe, they could close the door they had opened. "Everyone, gather around," Mark said, taking charge. "We're going to finish this together." They formed a circle around the table, the remaining cards spread out before them. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the booklet. "There's one last thing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A final incantation to seal the ritual." "What does it say?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. Sarah's eyes flicked over the words, her face growing paler with each line she read. "We have to speak it together. It's a binding spell, to seal the entity away." Mark swallowed hard. "Then let's do it." They joined hands, forming a tight circle around the table. The air grew thick with tension, the shadows in the room growing darker, more sinister. Sarah began to speak, her voice trembling with fear. "In darkness we called, in darkness we bind. This ancient force, to shadows confined." Mark joined in, his voice rough with terror. "Return to the void from whence you came. We sever the bond, we end this game." The room grew colder, the shadows swirling around them like a living thing. The air crackled with energy, and Mark felt a pressure building in his chest, as if something was trying to force its way in. "Close the door, seal the night. We banish the horror, we end the fright." The words hung in the air, a final plea against the darkness that surrounded them. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin like a beast enraged. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was absolute, pressing in on them from all sides. Mark held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Had it worked? Had they done it? Then, slowly, the shadows began to recede. The air grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting from the room. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body sagging with relief. "It's over," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "We did it." Mark looked around, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the entity, but it was gone. The cabin was still, the night outside quiet and peaceful. They had won. But as they sat there, their hands still clasped in a circle. Mark couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of his mind. They had closed the door, but had they truly banished the entity? Or had it simply gone back to where it had come from, waiting for the next group of foolish souls to summon it? Only time would tell. For now, they were safe. The game was over. But the darkness would always be watching, waiting for the chance to return. And they would never forget the price they had paid to end it.